Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and this is Chasing Legends. Welcome back, Chasing Legends this week. Before we get any further, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bells to find out when we're doing any of our videos coming out right now. We're kind of doing stuff on Mondays and Fridays. And leave a comment if you want to leave a comment. If it's about something you want to throw something else in there, inquire, have any questions or anything to ask. We answer, we read all comments. You'll see the little thumbs up or whatever like button on those clicked because we always kind of review and check them out. Go to the About section. Legend of Superstition Mountains Dutch Hunter Rendezvous shirts, black, gray, long sleeve, short sleeve. You can pick them up there. We don't make a dime off of any of this stuff, so go for it. Go have it. Be styling and profiling, wearing the same gear that we wear when we're running around. That being all said and done, we'll get into this week's thing. Kind of a little bit of a history thing, and it's a tutorial kind of meant for a lot of people because a lot of our audience aren't from Arizona. We get a lot of people all around the country and even people outside of our own country, the United States, that kind of tune in and listen to this stuff, and then we reference things, and I understand sometimes they're probably hitting Wikipedia, Google and stuff trying to figure out what are we talking about, and then, well, how do you spell that word? So I want to cover some of that. I know some people say, well, that's not what I know, or, people are going to sit there and go, well, I know for a fact. Okay, well, it's not about that. It's about kind of an overview so people kind of have an idea with some of the stuff we talk about and some of the words and phrases we use, and then they have a kind of general idea of history. So we're not critiquing things at all. So we'll open it up with, because, the most federally recognized tribal members in the United States aren't from Alaska, where 1 in 6 people are federally recognized as coming from a tribal nation. It's not California, it's not Texas, it's not Oklahoma, South Dakota, Montana. Guess where it is? It's Arizona. Over 330,000 federally recognized tribal members here, and 21 associated tribes that make their home in Arizona. Population of Arizona is probably around 7 million, so I don't know what that is, 1 in 21 people. But anyhow, we grow up with that influence around here, and this video won't be just about that. This is one of those videos where everything I unpack is not really about what we're talking, but there are 21 federally recognized, and this is where I put myself on the spot, because in the back of my mind, I probably know all 21, but let's see how many I can get. We have the Cocopah, the Colorado River tribe, the Hualapai, the Havasupai. We have the Yaqui Nation. We have the Fort McDowell Yavapai Apache. We have the Prescott Yavapai. We have the Camp Verde Yavapai Apache. And I'm trying to keep track for myself here. We have the Cocopah. You have the Navajo Nation. You have the Hopi Nation. You have the White Mountain Apache, the Tonto Apache, the San Carlos Apache. We have the Salt River Pima tribe. We have the Gila River Pima Maricopa tribe. We have the Aktchin community in the Tohono O'odham. I believe that's about 18. And now what am I missing? Oh, Fort Mojave group. And we have 2 Paiute nations. They would be the Tonto Paiute, I believe. No, the Kaibab Paiute, San Juan Paiute. That puts me around 19 or 20, I think. And I really feel bad that I can't remember the last couple, and if you do, don't have to shout them out, because I will be looking them up after here. But for the most part, it's a lot of federal, and as you can see, there's a lot of diversity within these groups, and these various groups. And if it comes to me, because I did say Cocopah, and I did, okay, so. But the idea is there's a lot of these groups, and if you travel Arizona, if you grow up here, you live here, you come across this, and it's just kind of like, you don't really recognize a lot of that. It's just we weave in and out of it. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. But one thing we will talk about before we get into the scheme of things here is generational. And a lot of times you use the term generational. Generational is, I recognize it as every 25 years, which is what most people do. That's a guitar that Trevor decided to kick. Fortunately, it's a guitar I didn't care about as much that he kicked. And he's also got kind of a funny look on his face because he knows maybe I actually, when the camera stops, I will care. But anyhow, 25 years is generational. Every 100 years, I always recognize as 4 generations: your grandfather, your father, yourself, and then your son. You can lose that 4th generation if they like going around kicking wooden instruments like they don't think about them as they sit around when they're sitting in a music studio. But oh well. Anyway, so that covers kind of that. Is generational. Every 100 years, you figure there's about 4 generations that cover within that. I know some people can say it's 30. Sometimes in a 100-year period, there's 5 generations. We're just going to say that to simplify the math, because making math easy is great for all of us. So that being said and done, the other thing, and I have a problem with this terminology, and Trevor's heard me talk about it for years, the term Anglo, okay? Anglo means English speaking. So if you talk Anglo-Saxon, it's the Saxons that came into England and they developed the English language. They're called Anglo-Saxons. So we always hear about, for this, and there's the various periods in the Spanish colonization, and then the Mexican government, Mexican independence, and then the Gadsden Purchase and all this, and they talk about the Anglo-Europeans. Well, it's kind of a weird term because Anglo would mean anyone from England. If you talk to someone from Scotland, Ireland, or Wales, they would probably also feel that they're not necessarily Anglos because while they're white people, they have their own specific languages: Gaelic, Celtic, Welsh. Jacob Waltz is not an Anglo-American. He was white, but he's German-speaking. In fact, a lot of the people that settled the Salt River Valley came from somewhere else: France, Germany, Italy. They were Europeans. English became their second language. So the terminology Anglo is wrong. I will not use it. They were American pioneers, or the immigrant pioneers. They were pioneers, but they not necessarily weren't Anglo, because here's technically the problem we have with this. Every federally recognized tribal nation in the United States, they all speak English. That means they're Anglo-Navajo, Anglo-Apache. No, they're not. So it doesn't mean white, it means English-speaking, and you can't just interchangeably use it like, well, it's an English-speaking person, and anyone that knows English, therefore, is an Anglo. It doesn't work like that. And that's because I think they want to avoid using the term white. There's nothing wrong with saying white European, because the Spanish were white Europeans. And therefore, and technically, a lot of the tribal groups that came over originally came over from Russia and Asia and so forth. So you can always, but we're not looking at that back. But I don't like the term. So if someone uses that term in the comments, I am not going to answer you because I do not like the term. I don't find it in most of the books I read. I find it in books other people read that didn't go to college or didn't study or put their time in. They read books by other people that didn't know. I understand what the term means. If you look it up and it says it means white people, yeah, okay. I could say there's a lot of things that mean certain things, but they really don't. So we'll get by that. So I will be using terminology. You'll be saying, oh, that seemed kind of an odd term for him to use for that, but I'm using the proper terminology. So getting to that, basically, we're getting into the past yesteryear, not to the 21 federally recognized groups or these things. We're actually stepping back. So now we're getting to the meat and potatoes of today. And it's stuff that we use. Some of it we use quite a bit in Legend of the Superstition Mountains. We used in the TV series with History Channel. And some of it we didn't even touch upon at all. These prior kind of prehistory original groups, there's 6 of them that are generally known. Up in the northern area of Arizona, you had the group of the Anasazi. And to the east, along the Colorado River, you had, oh, I keep forgetting their name, the Tapayana or something like that. I'm pretty sure that was it. Around Flagstaff, overlapping other groups areas was the Sinagua. And then you had over under the Anasazi to the east. Yeah, the east. The west was the Tapayan, was the Mogollon people. The Mogollon people were very similar to the people that later came, the Apache. They were kind of hunter-gatherers and moved through the Mogollon country. They also overlap with the Sinagua and the Anasazi a bit, and the group below them, the Salado, and then besides the Anasazi, the other largest group that covered most all of southern Arizona was the Hohokam. Now, the Hohokam were pretty large group, and they lasted quite some time. to put it in perspective of kind of way things are, the Mayan groups were from about year 0 to 900, so it's about 36 generations. And we know the Mayans had trade routes and they traded with a lot of people. And you have to remember, what we see as Mexico and Arizona and all back then was more like fertile farmland. There was a lot of things were completely different. And because of that, we could have seen trade routes, and we are the assumption is were probably trade routes, and there was, especially for a group like the Mayans, that was around for 900 years. The Aztecs, which get confused with people without really any knowledge with the Mayans, came after the Mayans, and they lasted around, their big culture impact was about 200-300 years. So you figure out 300 years, about 12 generations, and that was during their time period where the Spanish came and the Spanish colonization. Spanish colonization comes in towards the end of the 13th century, which would be the 1400s, into the 1500s, the Spanish colonization. And that period lasts till the 1800s, early 1800s. Now, the Mexican Independence War was about 1810, 1820. And remember, I'm just kind of giving you that ballpark so you know where everything was. And then then they seceded the areas that the Mexicans would later have as Arizona, New Mexico, and California. So the Spanish were finally out of there about 1820. So the Spanish held that ground for many generations and for an extended period of time. Spanish never could push much further past than Tucson. While they did do groups and people did go out, wander around looking at stuff, they couldn't establish themselves very far north because of a group that came from the plains through Texas, through New Mexico, and into Arizona called the Apache. And the Apache were just fierce. While the Spanish had problems with the Pima and the Tohono O'odham and everybody else out there that would have rebellions and uprisings and peace and war and different things, the Apache just never made any peace. And one of the reasons was that once towards the end of the Spanish group and definitely the Mexican government group, they started an eradication process that the United States did as well. And one of the problems with it was they paid for scalps. So anyone and everyone was going out and get scalps. When you can get money for scalps, men, women, and children, it didn't matter. There was a price value on them. And you realize everybody else has black hair around there. You just kill whoever you run into, bring the scalps in and say, yeah, I killed these guys. So anybody that basically could pass for anybody indigenous, they did that, and they just started going through in a tear. And it made a big problem, created a huge problem with the Apache, who hated the Mexicans and hated the Spanish. And they just had problems with everybody. They were a group that just thought it was kind of pleasant enough as we'll hunt and we'll gather and so forth, and sometimes we'll go over to your place and take stuff. And you may not like it, but just let's not get it too messed up. And then if you got it too messed up, then they got upset and then they came after you to kill you. And then they got worse and worse. But the atrocities were grown worse. A lot of the groups and those tribal groups in those times during the Spanish and early Mexican era were probably a little more, they would war between each other, but I think it was far more peaceful until it was introduced. Like once the monetary system's in there for eradication, then all hell broke loose. Now, one of the things that's puzzling for a lot of people here is you're saying, okay, the Spanish had control to about 1820 and all, but then around 1853 we have the Gadsden Purchase, and before that they seceded some of the land about 10-15 years before to the U.S., so we know Jacob Waltz and those guys in the 1830s, 40s could start coming in. 1853, we got that flood. Well, that's only like 30, 40 years. Yeah, the Mexican, as we see it in Mexico, the Mexican people, the Mexican government, only had the southern area of Arizona, most Arizona, and then the southern area for 40 years or about 20 years. They had it very, very, very short time. The influence is there because of the Spanish and, of course, the Mexican people who were descended from these different groups. But Mexico had probably, while there is quite an imprint culturally, as far as Mexico's concerned itself, there was very little ownership of anything that's southern Arizona, and it's just what it was. The Spanish were there. They finally fought the Spanish, 1810, 1820, the Spanish give it up. By 1853, the United States is picking up Arizona because the Mexicans had the same problem. The Mexican government had the same problem the Spanish did. They just couldn't win or gain ground and protect the people up here. So that led to where we suddenly saw the United States military coming in and the pioneers and so forth and Jacob Waltz. Now, kind of telling all that, and it kind of gives you a history and kind of gives you an idea, and it's kind of a jumble. It shows you the overlaps. And one of the groups we deal with most of the times, we talk about the Hohokam and the Salado. And they kind of, look at about midway through the superstitions, the Salado's boundary is, and the Hohokam. So one's western boundary and eastern boundary, they kind of cross up. So the Salado are very similar to the Hohokam. They would be farmers, and they would irrigate, and they would have pueblos and small cliff dwellings and so forth, and so did the Hohokam. The Hohokam we're generally known as Pueblo Grande, Casa Grande, the big houses and stuff. And it's hard to understand how extensive and how huge these communities are. Snaketown, which was down by Sacaton, the Gila River, Pima Maricopa community, was a huge place. You can't see it. There was an archaeological dig in the 1920s, and after it was done, they literally buried the whole place again. Nobody can drive out there, nobody can go out there. There is a small cemetery by there, but they basically, to preserve it, put it back underground. So it is preserved, it's there, you can find books on it and so forth, and there was a lot of photographs. They took everything, they checked it out, they documented it and everything, and then they did this wonderful thing, I think personally, is they put it back underground, and now it's just big flat desert. They buried it to preserve it, which is very awesome. But you get into Sacaton and Blackwater, there's all kinds of petroglyphs and areas and very old cultural through there. Of course, Pueblo Grande and Casa Grande in Coolidge, which Casa Grande is not in Casa Grande, it's in Coolidge, which is down the road between, and Sacaton and Blackwater in between. It shows you how big these communities were. And in the Phoenix area, the canal systems and so forth, just being in the Superstition Mountains tells you how big the Hohokam were, was because you find these isolated villages and places. All through the Superstitions, I must know about 25 or 30 small groupings of village-type sections. Garden Valley is a well-known one. Then you have what's known as Hieroglyphic Canyon or Apache Spring, which brings us to a legend episode we will be touching on the calendar stone that was at the Latter-day Saints. And I lost my train of thought. But anyways, at the temple in Mesa was many years called the Calendar Stone, which was not from the Superstitions, but we will be covering that because it was documented as not being from there. But it got in a newspaper and they used one word, Hieroglyphic Canyon, and everybody thought it came from the Superstitions for about 80, 90 years. It got put back to the rightful group and the rightful owners and so forth, and we will document that because we were on that before we found out someone actually handled it very, very well. So thumbs up to them. But these groups were very, very huge and large, and it's very extensive, all going into southern Arizona. And we visited some of those places of these groups and what happened in the missions in the area, but we look at that prehistory. Prehistory is very important because the city of Phoenix, which is, I think, in the top 10 populated, but what is it, number 6 or 7 in the nation? Phoenix is basically built on the Hohokam community and the canals. And if we had been able to utilize that and reopen and use that, Phoenix wouldn't have existed because of the water source. Now, what happened to the Hohokam? Well, with a lot of these groups, we don't know what happened. The Anasazi, the Hohokam, the Salado, most of their names are just kind of something the people. Because the people that came in after them didn't know who they were. They were gone. Now, they might have spread out and incorporated into some other groups, but the main body of these groups, nobody knows what happened. We don't have a written language from them, so other than the petroglyphs, we don't have anything. We kind of guess at their cultures. There's no one that can be technically said is a Hohokam expert at linguistics and everything else, because we don't know who they were, what the people they were. They've checked dental on the Hohokam, the Anasazi, and other groups and find some kind of similar. They think they kind of worked their way in with groups. They believe the Anasazi might have with the Hopi, but it's hard to say. They just vanished. It was probably droughts. It could have been disease. Could have been they just said, heck with it. We don't really know. We just know after about 1,400 years, a lot of these groups just vanished. Now, this is when the desert came. Now, when we talked about Spanish colonization, when the Spanish came into Arizona, they were only about 90 to 100 years, 3 to 4 generations from when the Hohokam, Anasazi, all these groups disappeared. So they came in, and by those 4 generations, the groups that moved in afterwards had no idea. They just talked about them as the people, and they were very superstitious, very reverent to those places, but they didn't inhabit those cliff dwellings in those places. They stayed away from them. Now, why do we have these places and have what we have today? In the 1920s, archaeologists started running around and they found people who were amateur archaeologists or just private collectors or whatever found that people traveling through Arizona and so forth, once we had the automobile, loved to buy things as they went through. So people would just go down to Casa Grande and whatever and just pick up pottery and pots and whatever, bones even, and they would sell them at places and sell them to people. And the archaeologists realized, wow, there's kids here having picnics, climbing the walls of these ruins. We need to preserve them. And people suddenly realized we need to preserve this stuff. So in the 1920s is when a lot of the preservation efforts happened. The earliest pictures you see of Casa Grande, and when people saw it, they're just sitting on the walls and whatnot, and people are marking their names all over them, and they were just having picnics inside stuff. They didn't think anything of it, and you never thought anything of, oh, there's a manos and matate, hey, there's some pots there, hey, what's this? Dig it up, it's some guy's burial spot, but let's take some of this stuff home, and people would put it on their shelves and stuff. So it was a really nice thing in the 1920s and 30s that they started to preserve these types of things. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have had much of anything left because everything would have been destroyed. If you go to Casa Grande today, it has a roof over it, and they're in the process still of trying to rebuild bits and pieces and preserve it as much as possible because it can't last forever because it's basically mud brick. There's groups that feel they came from some of these people, and this and that, and they try to look at it DNA-wise, but it's very difficult. So when we use the word Hohokam, we're talking about those Pueblo-dwelling people that were in the Salt River Valley, but extensively through most of the superstitions. But you will hear me use the word Hohokam and Salado because the Salado were in the area as well, and it's difficult other than if you're an expert on pottery or certain techniques, and since they were so close and traded together, you don't sometimes know if you're dealing with them. Additionally, when it came to burial aspects, groups and tribes and different groups in those eras would do different things depending where they were. So there was in the superstitions, and perhaps someday we'll do a Chasing Legends. We did some photography there before. There's a crematorium in the superstitions where people were burned, and someone once told me it was Anasazi, but I wouldn't believe the Anasazi were that far south. So I would think it was probably Hohokam or Salado, and they were burning the bodies there and so forth. And there's other areas where they buried them, like in Garden Valley, in a kneeling or sitting position in burial mounds. So you see these different aspects of how they had burial customs and different rites from similar groups that lived in the same similar area. So when we generally think of these things, and it was a huge problem I had with history and A&E, and we had a 3-hour lecture from me they actually filmed, standing up at Black Cross Butte talking how we keep identifying people in general terms. And I was very pissed off because I said, you can't do that. Each clan, each group, they can have such different beliefs and things they do, and they have certain things that are common, but you can't just act like a Pimas, a Navajo, or a Hopi. You just can't interchange people because it just isn't fair culturally. We keep recognizing them as just Indians, and we're not recognizing them as individual people, as these people are from Ireland, and these people in Ireland come from here. And so that became a huge problem for me, and we were discussing it, and I said basically it became an issue where I was telling the production team that you're doing the same thing that everybody has done. You have two sides of the story. You have all the people over here, the Sedona types and the Vortex types and the White Indian types doing this peace, love bullshit crap. And then you have this side of the Hollywood of let's just characterize them this way, and they're the mysterious and the shamanism and this certain other crap, which both sides do. And I said that there's a middle ground of people you just grew up with and you knew their grandparents and they had some cool stories and stuff, but they're just people. And all these people come from somewhere different. So when you grew up in a neighborhood with the Italian people and the Polish people and the Czech people and this people and that, it was, everybody had culturally different little things, but we all celebrated Christmas. We all did. But nobody just lumped us in as just because everybody understood. They had, you know, the Italian grandmas made the best Italian food. We knew that. And I knew where to get the best nachos on the neighborhood or the best burritos because their family was generationally was making food. But I didn't think of them any differently, but I knew each of these families was somewhat different. Well, we don't do that in that, and A&E in history I felt was not doing that. It was a great disservice. They walked into something, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing this, is to clear the air a little. That is, they basically came in and they would sit in production meetings, and I would talk to them about it and say, yeah, well, there's this story and this story and this story. And they would take and get creative with it. And then they would go to Woody, who had no idea and no knowledge of any of this, and tell poor Woodrow, okay, you're the Indian expert, and this is what you know, and you got to talk about this. And Woody had no clue, so he'd have to come over to me and ask me for some kind of pointers, some bullet points, and then he would make stuff up. And it was really kind of sad, because it does an incredible disservice. They would get half of something right and half of something wrong. So they're listening to me, they half listen, they make some notes, they take it to the writing team, and the writing team, bless their hearts, decide to take it and then tell a story with it. And by the time I'm sitting there and I'm trying to react to it, I'm going, what the hell are we doing? Why are you having him talk? What is he talking about? And I felt like they were culturally just mishmashing everything together, and it was wrong, because you should recognize people from where they come from and the differences and the reasons. They wanted the atrocity type Apaches and this and that and everything else. I don't know any people who are Apache that go out and kill people or anything like that, or the mean, spiteful people and this and that. I grew up with people, and I was good friends with a number of people, and I just didn't get it, because I thought, that's not what they want to see. And why are you guys doing that? Because it doesn't make them proud. They don't feel fierce because of that. It casts that illusion of, like, you know, people get that illusion of what they think people are like. And, you know, I won't even tell those stories of people that have come from out of state that go through the reservations out here, and their expectation is, well, I didn't get this. They don't realize how poverty-stricken they are, how bad it is. Trevor's got to see some of this, be part of this, and understand it. But you want to incorporate it, because there's poor people everywhere, and they're just poor people. They're not poor this, poor that. They're just poor people that live in an area, in a spot where they just can't get out of it. Like so many people in poverty-stricken small towns, once you're locked, and it's hard to break loose. So kind of my rant, and I did 3 hours, and they had a huge problem with it, because they couldn't get me to talk about anything but that once I got into it. Because I basically, one of the things I think history loved was I equated the way they portray Native Americans in film and on television generally as a rule. And they've done changes. There are some good shows now that do some proper things. But I said basically, your version of television is like handing people blankets with smallpox and measles on it. And they were not really big on that. So Frank and nobody was around. They cleared everybody out and then just took it to me. We went around the corner down a canyon, and we just laid into it. And if anybody was ever to get that 2-3 hour rant where I'm standing on a rock just letting them have it into the camera, it's probably a beautiful moment, a very proud moment. But it created a lot of issues and problems, because they couldn't use me to speak about certain things, because I drew a line. And I said, this is the line we draw, which I point out at the medicine wheel. I'm in the center of the group. There's something being said. I'm sitting there. You can tell I'm pissed off. And then they cut to the next scene, and I'm on the end of the group. I magically transport my body to the end of the group in a cut-in scene. And that's the reason for that, is I would not deliver any lines for them, because I was so tired of it, because I felt it was doing a disservice. I thought, we're here to tell history. We're here to impart some type of the truth to people that come into Arizona, people that are interested in the Superstition Mountains. And if we're not doing so, then I refuse to be a part of it. The person I got to thank for that was someone I ran into. Basically, Jesse Feldman told me, if you don't want to do it, then just keep your mouth shut, because if you try to work around it, they'll edit you. And so I learned not even to move my lips. So I would just sit there and put my lips shut, and then just smoke a cigarette and just stare at the camera. And they would have to move on, and then Frank, Woody, or one of the other guys would deliver it. So I did that because, to me, integrity was important in that aspect of nothing else. When you're talking history, get it right. So I hope you enjoyed that little bit, because we will be touching upon the Mayans and the Aztecs, the Hohokam and the Salado, and things in some of the legend stuff. So that'll clear that up. You'll understand about the Spanish colonization. Look it up. Read a book. There's a lot of great books about this information, and you can learn so much. And maybe we'll break some of this stuff down, smaller size, and get kind of more in depth in it. But definitely, it's a kind of little bit. You come into Arizona, you're going to have an idea how large scale all this is. So that's about it for this week. Don't have any books to recommend, any film. Well, you know what? pick up Jesse Feldman's book, Trail, or Dutchman's Trail. That's it, right? Yeah, Dutchman's Trail. Pick up Jesse's book if you're at Goldfield Ghost Town or the museum or down at the OK Corral gift shop. I will still work on him, continue to text him occasionally and say, hey, dude, put it online so people can buy it. Kind of a good read. I always want to get those books out there because if people quit putting the books out there and you can't get them, why do you even care? You watch my video and that's about it, and you're not getting word of anything else. So that being it for this week, and nothing else I got going on right now, is we're cutting the Legends stuff and we're finishing the cuts of Sunsets, which I will give you another little tease. Sunsets is not about the Lost Dutchman Mine. It's not about the Lost Dutchman Mine. It's about the Dutch hunters, and it's very, very cool. So when you get a chance to kind of see, and I'm hoping this spring, Trevor will allow us to do a sneak preview or put some trailer together for it so you get to see what it is a bit. I think you're going to really like this because it's kind of more from the heart and from the Dutch hunter perspective and all. Very cool thing. But go out there, Lust for Gold's still running around, pushing itself out all over social media. So catch that if you get a chance. If nothing else, and no other reason to look back and at the beginning and end of the film, see our old good friend Rick Gwynn out there. So we miss Rick dearly. But that being said, we're going to move forward here. I'm going to get done for the night and let Trevor cut this thing up and put it together so Monday afternoon you have it. So until the next time, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and guess what? You're not. And this was Chasing Legends. Take care and have a good week.